This place we're talking about is the beautiful lush island of Mljet, tucked away in the southernmost tip of Croatia, right in the middle of the crystal clear waters of the Adriatic Sea. This is exactly where the story I want to tell you begins. There are two very specific spots on this island where, back in the day, massive merchant ships coming from India used to drop anchor and unload some pretty strange cargo that no one imagined would completely flip the fate of this region upside down. Back then, they hauled tons of heavy wooden crates and cages down from the ship decks. Workers struggled, dragging them deep into the island's thick forests to release creatures that had never set foot on European soil until that day. The locals watching the whole scene had no clue that instead of saving them, these little animals were about to turn into an endless nightmare. One that even their great-great-grandchildren would have to deal with. The thing was, for a very long time, the locals on this island were constantly losing their lives to the bites of horned vipers, a terrifying type of venomous snake known as Vipera amidites. They had no sense of safety. These venomous snakes had multiplied so much that after 1910, nobody dared to step outside at night or walk through the tall grass in the fields, gardens, or even near their own homes. At that time, on this remote island, there was basically no decent medical care or anti-venom that could stop the effects of the snake's deadly toxin. If you got bitten, you were pretty much a goner. Farmers and shepherds went to work in fear every single day because at any moment, one of these horned vipers could jump out from behind a rock and end their lives. Because of the state of emergency, the government officials at the time, who were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, decided they had to find a solution to this crisis. The only solution they could come up with was to bring the snake's ultimate natural enemy, the mongoose, to the island to settle the score with these vipers once and for all. You should know that in India, mongooses are famous snake killers. They're like real-life ninjas that can hunt snakes in massive numbers with lightning speed, and they can even survive the most toxic bites. So, on this end, the Croatians, who were fed up with the snakes, headed over to India, rounded up a bunch of these agile critters, and brought them back by ship to release them into the forests of Mljet. The mongooses made themselves at home very quickly and started breeding. But instead of just sticking to a snake diet, they had other plans for the island that nobody saw coming. Interestingly, they didn't just let the mongooses loose right away. They put them through a strict quarantine period so their bodies could gradually get used to Croatia's environment and climate without getting sick. The whole process was personally overseen by a senior engineer and highly experienced forester named Carlo Nadli, who watched their every move like a hawk. These poor mongooses spent over a month in a custom-built enclosure that cost a fortune to make just to see if they could even survive the Mediterranean climate. Once they saw the animals were in good spirits and adjusting well, they finally opened the cages. But they had no idea that by doing so, they were losing control of the situation forever. Now, the question is, if mongooses aren't even native to Europe, how did they come up with the idea to bring them from the other side of the world? And exactly how many did they bring? Since mongooses aren't native to Europe at all, there was no way to find them in neighboring countries or anywhere near Croatia. To make sure this massive project didn't flop, officials had to look toward the animal's natural habitat in South Asia. For help, they picked India because the mongooses there are world-renowned pro-snake killers, especially when it comes to cobras and vipers, and they're famous for being fearless and lightning fast. Coordinating the transport of these animals took a ton of time and energy because they had to cross oceans on the steamships of that era just to reach this tiny island. The goal was to build a real sustainable population, not just show off a couple of animals to the public. This is where the numbers get really important, because if you release just one or two animals on a big island, the odds of them finding each other to meet are slim to none. If the numbers were too low, the species would have gone extinct fast, and all the government's hard work and money would have gone down the drain. So they did some careful math to ensure a strong Founder population. C. In biology, the male to female ratio is huge. If that ratio is off, the reproduction rate plummets and the whole project crashes and burns. To make sure the mongooses could take over the entire island as fast as possible, they chose 7 males and, for females, the idea was that competition among the males would keep the females constantly pregnant, leading to a population explosion. This strategy was supposed to guarantee that even if a few animals died from disease or accidents, the rest could keep the line going without skipping a beat. With this specific gender ratio, they were hoping that within a few years, thousands of mongooses would be roaming the forests of Mljet, leaving no snake behind. The release site for these 11 Indian travelers was also very calculated. They didn't just dump them in the middle of nowhere since they needed basic resources. To survive, mongooses absolutely need fresh water, underground burrows, and of course, plenty of prey to establish their territory and compete with other animals. If they hadn't been released in the right spot, they probably would have died of hunger or thirst in the first week, and the snakes would have gone right back to their glory days. From day one of the release, these 11 mongooses started patrolling the forests and gradually expanded their territory from that initial spot to every nook and cranny of the island. But what nobody had stopped to think about was, once the snakes are all gone, what are these animals going to do to fill their bellies? Most of the time, these kinds of projects where you bring a new species to a different place end in a total flop because the animals can't handle the new food or the climate. But the Mljet mongooses proved they were way more resilient than that. It was like they were pre-programmed for life in Croatia. They didn't have any serious rivals or big predators on the island to hold them back, so they just kicked back and started eating and breeding like crazy. In just the first few years, their population exploded, and they managed to fully adapt to every environment from thick forests to coastal cliffs. This high level of adaptability turned them from a tiny group of 11 into a literal army that took total control of the island. They built nests and holes under rocks and among the bushes, traveling huge distances every day to find fresh prey. They spread so fast that in less than 2 decades, they became a completely normal, everyday part of the island's ecosystem, and the locals had gotten used to seeing them around. This rapid expansion was the first sign that big things were coming, but people still thought it was a massive success because the snakes were disappearing. In a closed system like an island, when a new and powerful predator moves in, the pressure on the prey becomes so intense that the balance of the whole area gets totally thrown off. The mongooses were doing exactly what they were brought there to do, and they started hunting the horned vipers, the ones that had been terrorizing the locals for years, with a weird kind of greed. Within about 20 years, the data showed that the snake population had plummeted, and you could barely find a single viper in the island's wilderness. This meant they were crushing their main job, and government officials were patting themselves on the back for making such a smart move. But the real trouble started right there, because when a predator's main food source runs out, that animal isn't just going to sit around and wait to starve to death. The law of nature is pretty simple. If your primary prey isn't available, move on to prey number 2 and 3 to stay alive. When the mongooses saw there were no more snakes to eat, they switched up their diet and went after the other defenseless creatures on the island that had no way to protect themselves. Being super smart and fast hunters, they figured out that birds, their eggs, and even tiny chicks could be a very easy and tasty meal. This dietary shift was a total disaster for the island's wildlife because Mljet's native birds had never faced an enemy like this before and had no clue how to guard their nests. This situation was no longer a success story. It was turning into an environmental catastrophe that was wrecking the entire food chain. Now, nobody was thinking about the snakes anymore because everyone was worried about the birds and other animals that were vanishing from the island's map one by one. You can't just brush this disaster off as a few random accidents. When a predator gets comfortable and nobody's there to check them, the impact goes way deeper than that. Stats show that some bird species on Mljet Island have gone completely extinct, or their numbers have dropped so low you barely see them anymore. The scars from this destruction are still plain as day over 100 years later, and the region's biodiversity has taken a massive hit. But it didn't just stop at wildlife and forest birds. When the mongooses realized there was nothing left to eat in the woods, they headed straight for the nearby houses. When a predator's population goes off the charts and they lose their fear of humans, they start sneaking into yards and barns to find a meal. These mongooses got so bold that they break into chicken coops at night and pick off chickens and chicks one by one, total sitting ducks for the farmers and locals whose entire livelihood depended on those few birds. This was a straight-up economic disaster. Before long, this mess affected every single person on the island, and nobody had food or financial security anymore, thanks to these former heroes. Besides devouring birds and chicks, the mongooses turned their attention to crops and started wrecking gardens and vineyards. They dig up the ground, looking for roots or bugs, damaging the roots of trees and grapevines that were vital to the island's wine industry. Now, the question is, why even take such a huge risk and bring in a total outsider animal in the first place? The truth is, the snake problem was so bad that people and officials felt they had to pay any price to get rid of them. Back then, venomous snakes were everywhere, like a plague, and people were literally living in fear of death. So, any solution that looked like it would cut down the snake population was welcomed with open arms. When a snake bite can take down a full-grown cow, just imagine how deadly it can be for a kid or an old man. People were rightfully fed up and demanding the government do something to wipe out those damn horn vipers. But the path they chose, bringing in mongooses, was like using an atomic bomb to kill a mosquito.